Hey, Dean. You want to lead a song?
Yes.
What are you going to lead?
Blue skies and rainbows, but
Okay.
I need to get something.
I know. Let me get that over there, and you can
I need
stay right here. Come on, Dean. We're going to go ahead and get started with a song. So if you would be making your way to your seats, tell them what you're going to sing. You're good.
Jesus. What? Blue skies and rainbows. Blue skies and rainbows and sunbeams from heaven are what I can see when my Lord is living in me. I know that Jesus is well and alive today. He made his home in my heart. Nevermore will I be all alone since he promised me that we never would part.
Thanks, bud. You can. And you can preach on the stool if you want to. All right, it's time to begin our next session. Thankful to Eddie Parrish for his great work at the Brown Trail congregation, his friendship in the Word, and his fellowship in Christ. Excited about our continuation through the book of Nehemiah. Every spot after lunch is difficult. The spot after brisket and pulled pork may be the most difficult. And we were strategic in putting Eddie right here because I know that he'll do a great job. We're asking him to come down and preach the word to us.
Our song leader for this session did such a great job barefooted, I wondered if I might preach barefooted. He could do as well as he did. It's always good to be here, and it is difficult at these afternoon sessions, especially after the great feast that we had. So if I nod off during this, somebody wake me up and we'll proceed. Glad you're here. Peter offered a warning that we would always do well to remember. Be sober-minded. Be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, walks around as a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith. 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 8 and 9. Satan is a lot of things, and one of them is relentless. He doesn't give up easily. And in Nehemiah chapter 6, we find there the last of 3 consecutive chapters that expose the different ways that Satan will try to disrupt the work that God would have us to do. The rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall was a major step forward in the restoration of the people back to Judea following their 70-year exile in Babylon. And the enemies of God, who had given themselves over to do the devil's work, they understood, as well as the Jewish people understood, how momentous that was for them to get the wall rebuilt around the city. They knew how important it was. Yet they were on a mission to halt the good work of God's people. And as willing pawns in Satan's hand. They were willing to do whatever it was that they could to try to frustrate that work. And so in chapter 4, they ridiculed the people, referring to them as these feeble Jews, chapter 4, verse 2. They ridiculed their work, the wall itself, in chapter 4, verse 3, where if a fox ran across it, the whole wall would tumble to the ground, they said. In chapter 5, you had internal strife that had begun to rear its head among the people. Again, an attempt to get the work to stop, where you had some of the wealthy people who were oppressing some of the poorer people from within the Jewish community there. And now in this chapter, in chapter 6, Satan is not going to give up. He has other plans, but now he is going to turn his attention to Nehemiah himself. And he's going to try to get Nehemiah to stop doing what he's doing in leading the work, to hopefully try to get the work itself to stop. What we're going to do as we look at Nehemiah chapter 6 is we're going to focus on how Nehemiah responded to the tactics of his enemies. We're going to do that because the very tactics that were implemented here in chapter 6 are the same things that enemies of the cross will try to use today. This chapter finds a very easy application to our circumstances today, specifically to elders and to preachers. And so the MO of Satan has not changed all these centuries later. So here's what they tried to do, the enemies tried to do with Nehemiah in chapter 6, and what enemies of the cross may try to do to us today to get us off of our important work. In the first place, he may try to bog things down in pointless conversations. In the second place, he may make threats. And in the third place, building off of making threats, is the attempt to instill fear. Those are the three things that he tries to do, that the enemies try to do with Nehemiah in chapter 6. And so we'll consider that, and we'll look at Nehemiah's response, which I would argue is the exact response that we ought to give in similar circumstances today. All right, so here we go. We're going to focus on the responses. Those are going to be the main points. So if you're taking notes, I would say this as point number 1. Decline pointless conversations. Decline pointless conversations. Look at our text, Nehemiah chapter 6, and let's look at the first 4 verses. Now when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although up to that time I had not set up the doors and the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, "Come and let us meet together at Hakkephirim in the plain of Ono." But they intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them, saying, "I'm doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" And they sent to me 4 times in this way. And I answered them in the same manner. When you look at this from the enemy's perspective, time was running out for them. They had tried ridicule back in chapter 4, tried to instill doubt, a lack of confidence in the people by their words intended to tear them down. None of that had worked. And we're told in verse 1 that these enemies, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the rest of the enemies, had come to see, they had learned that the wall had been built. It was almost completely finished. Still had some gates and doors to install, but it was basically done. So time was running out. They weren't getting anywhere. All of their attempts to that point had failed. And so next they tried to get Nehemiah himself away from the work. And they did that by proposing that they get together for a meeting. Everybody loves meetings, right? Well, that's what they wanted. And so they sent a message to him in verse 2 and said, hey, let's meet together. What was that meeting about? What did they want to accomplish? What were they trying to do? What was its purpose? Text doesn't say. No indication that they gave him a reason. Did they want to meet to feign cooperation so that they might be able to somehow weasel their way to the inside and cause trouble from the inside? I don't know. Was it just reconnaissance? Just meet together, maybe try to get him to talking so we can maybe figure out what their next move is, what their next step is? I don't know. Maybe they wanted to just simply entrap Nehemiah into endless discussions. Did they want to offer him a compromise in exchange for peace? Hey, we'll leave you alone. We'll quit bothering you if you do X, Y, or Z. What was the purpose of the meeting? I don't know. Maybe they didn't tell Nehemiah that. But one thing is certain, it all smelled pretty fishy to Nehemiah. He knew they were up to no good. He says that at the end of verse 2. They intended to do me harm. Now, verses 3 and 4 show us how Nehemiah responded to that. And I would argue that his response to their request showed tremendous wisdom. And we'll look at an application of that in just a moment. But his response was very simple. I'm doing a great work. I don't have time to come down. I don't have time for the meeting. Why should the work stop for me to simply come down and have some kind of meeting with you? He knew that the odds of anything good coming out of that gathering were between slim and none. And he knew that not because he had just arbitrarily out of the blue decided that these people weren't worthy of his time. These people had already shown who they were. They had already conducted themselves in such a way that he knew the character of these people. He knew that they weren't up to any good. He knew that they didn't have his best interest at heart. He knew all of that from past experience. And so he draws on that past experience and says, this smells fishy from top to bottom, and I'm not going to be a part of it. Sanballat and his buddies had no say in what was going on with that wall. It was none of their concern. And so he said no. If you were in John Baker's session this morning, he talked about how important it is for us, for everybody. His context was the life of a preacher. But for all of us, how important it is to count the cost of saying yes. That we get asked to do a lot of things. And every time you say yes to something, it automatically means you're saying no to something else. We have to count the cost of what's it going to cost me to say yes to this? Well, that's good advice. And Nehemiah, in his response, he considered that. He made his decision, and his response was clear. He essentially said to them, my work is more important than your meeting. Might that have been difficult to say? Well, probably. If Nehemiah was anything like a lot of us, it's hard to say no sometimes. It's hard to say no when somebody asks you to do something. But his experience taught him that in this situation, in this case, no was the proper answer. Sometimes antagonists want to meet. Sometimes people who view us perhaps as enemies want to have a meeting. Well, sometimes meetings with antagonists are necessary. We can't always avoid them, nor should we always avoid them. But in my experience, the times when we should meet with them tend to be the exception. Especially when the person who wants the meeting, the antagonist who wants the meeting, isn't even a member of the congregation where you're serving. They just may have heard something you said, or they've seen something that you've done at your particular congregation, and they don't like that, and so they want to get into a meeting with you about it. We need to be willing to say no to pointless conversations. You ever notice how often Paul warned Timothy and Titus about time-wasting discussions? Go back and read through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, and notice how many times Paul warned those two preachers, don't let people get you caught up into endless, pointless discussions. Let me just give you a few examples. 1 Timothy 1, verse 4. I'm just going to call attention to the language that Paul uses. Useless speculation. 1 Timothy 1, 6, fruitless discussion. 1 Timothy 4, 7, pointless fables. 1 Timothy 6, verse 4, he references those who have a morbid interest in controversial questions and fighting about words. Well, that never happens in the church. That never happens among preachers, right? Gentleman once, brother in Christ once, was talking to me about various biblical matters, and he expressed to me the desire to teach a Bible class. Well, that wasn't my call, right? The elders were going to make that call, but we were talking about it, and he said, true story. He said, I'm not sure what I would want to teach, but I know this much. I just want to teach about controversial things. I just want to deal with stuff that's controversy. Well, wisely, the elder said, no, we're not going to let you teach class. And for that reason, some people have, to use Paul's words, a morbid interest in controversial questions. Some people seem only to be interested in fighting and arguing about insignificant matters. Again, as Paul continues, 2 Timothy 2, verse 14, he warns against wrangling about words. He uses the word useless. He says it ruins the listener. That word ruin comes from the Greek word that gives us our English word catastrophe. Well, that says a lot. Foolish, ignorant speculations. 2 Timothy 2, verse 23. Pointless, foolish babbling. 2 Timothy 2, verse 16. Foolish controversies, disputes, unprofitable, worthless. Titus 3, verse 9. Are you sensing a pattern? Paul had a lot to say to preachers about watching your time and not allowing others to pull you into long, drawn-out discussions over matters that ultimately don't matter. some people will monopolize your time and your energy arguing about anything if you let them. And that's the key. I suspect Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem, they would have been more than happy to have wasted all kinds of Nehemiah's time, as long as it kept Nehemiah from doing what Nehemiah was supposed to be doing. Endless meetings with high maintenance, hard to please, overbearing, or cantankerous and divisive people does little more than take preachers and elders away from their important work. And Nehemiah had the wisdom to be able to discern that. And I would argue that we ought to spend some time in prayer asking God for the same wisdom. Yes, sometimes you do need to talk to people. Sometimes you need to answer questions. And sometimes you have discussions. But we need to have the wisdom to be able to discern which ones are important and which ones are not. It's okay, preacher. It's okay, elder. It's okay, Christian, to refuse to get dragged into a pointless controversy and to refuse it simply because you need to study for your Bible class. Think about that. We have these regular obligations, as preachers specifically. We have sermons to put together, and they don't put themselves together. We have classes to study for. And we do that because we have a congregation of people that are coming to hear the word of the Lord spoken. And they deserve to have it spoken as a result of good, solid study. Well, sometimes somebody may want to come around and gripe and grumble and pull you off into this direction and that direction and have a meeting about this and a meeting about that. It's okay to say, you know what, I've got a Bible class to put together. I'm doing a good work. And I can't just set all of that aside to come deal with your meaningless problem. Now, please don't misunderstand. Not all problems are meaningless. I'm not saying that. But some of them are. Some of them are just people that don't value your time. You need to be willing, in a nice way, but in an uncompromising way, say, you know what? I've got something else that I need to do that's vitally important. Nehemiah saw that, and he simply said no. It's okay to do that sometimes. I think we need to be reminded that it's okay to do that sometimes. Refuse pointless conversations. Number 2, dismiss gossip and threats. Dismiss gossip and threats. Now we're in verses 5 through 9 of chapter 6, where we see what Sanballat and Tobiah and those guys do when, after multiple requests, Nehemiah still won't come to their meeting. He sent me 4 times in this way. I answered him in the same manner. That's verse 4. Now, verse 5. In the same way, Sanballat, for the 5th time, sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. All right, so now they want to increase the pressure. They want this meeting. And they're going to try to pressure him into doing that. So he comes a 5th time with this open letter. Verse 6, in it was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That's why you're building the wall. And according to these reports, you wish to become their king. You've also set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there's a king in Judah. And now the king will hear of these reports. So now, Let us come together and take counsel. Well, isn't that nice? So with their repeated requests for a meeting rebuffed, Sanballat sends this messenger to Nehemiah with this open letter, this unsealed letter, that he threatens to publicize. You know, the devil knows how powerful the printed page can be. He knows as well as anyone that the pen is mightier than the sword. You know, that phrase did not come to be in a vacuum. There's a reason why that one has stood the test of time. Some people will believe anything if they see it in writing. Now, side point. On that note, I'd like to help you out a little bit. Some people will believe anything if they see it in writing. I'm here to let you know, no Nigerian prince is going to give you $1 million. I hate to be the one to break that to you, but just because you see that in print, it's not going to happen. You are not in danger. Hear me well. You are not in danger of waking up in a bathtub full of ice with one of your kidneys missing. Did you ever see that one? If a warrant for your arrest is about to be issued, I hope it's not, but if a warrant for your arrest is about to be issued, you are not going to receive an email telling you about it. And the police department will never ask you to pay a fine with a gift card. You ever wonder why those types of emails continue to be perpetrated? Why they continue to show up? Because they work. Because some people will believe anything if they see it in writing. Sanballat comes and he says, I've got a letter. You know what it says? The letter says that the only reason why you're rebuilding this wall is because you, Nehemiah, want to become their king. It says you've got prophets that you've put out among the people that are trying to get people to believe that God has set you up as their king. And I'm going to send this letter to the king of Persia. Unless you come to our meeting. And that open letter from Sanballat just drips with gossip. It is reported among the nations. You know what I heard? You know what I heard about brother so-and-so? It is reported among the nation. And Geshem also says it. Well, la-dee-da. What does Geshem know? And it's also said that according to these rumors, that this is going to happen and that's going to happen. People will believe anything if it's in print. Again, look at Nehemiah's response. Verse 8, then I sent to him saying, no such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind. Short, to the point, and punctuated with prayer. You'll see that at the end of verse 9, when he prays to God, strengthen my hands. Isn't that interesting? Because in the first part of verse 9, he says, they all wanted to frighten us, thinking their hands will drop from the work and it'll not be done. The enemies wanted their hands to fall, to drop, to stop the work. Nehemiah prays to God, no, God, strengthen my hands. A short response, a to-the-point response, a response punctuated by prayer. Nehemiah determined that he would not be intimidated into meeting with Sanballat and his cronies. He had better things to do, more important things to do, and he didn't have time to deal with all of that. You know, Winston Churchill was the one who wisely said, "You will never reach your destination if you stop and throw stones at every dog that barks." I think that's wise counsel. You'll never reach your destination if you stop and throw stones at every dog that barks. I'm measuring my words, Wayne. Do we have some barking dogs in the church? You'll never get to the destination that you want to go to in your life and in your ministry if you stop and throw rocks at every dog that barks. Or, as I like to say, if you'll forgive the crudeness of this proverb, never get into a puking contest with a buzzard. You'll lose every time. Wise leaders will remember that when some cantankerous brother with a platform decides he wants to stir up some controversy. Number 3, refuse to act out of fear. Refuse to act out of fear. You get down to verses 10 and following. We're introduced to a man named Shemaiah. And he comes to Nehemiah and says, middle of verse 10, "Let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They're coming to kill you by night." Fear. There's an assassination attempt, an assassination plot on your life, Nehemiah. But I know how we can fix it. I know how we can save you. Let's go into the temple, and we'll close the doors behind us, and you'll be safe there. More wisdom from Nehemiah in his response, which we'll get to in a second. But the reason why they wanted to do that, Nehemiah understood. If you look at verses 12 and 13, he said they were just trying to incite enough fear that he would do something foolish, like violate the law by going into the temple itself. That's what they wanted him to do because, and you'll see that again in verses 12 and 13, they wanted to be able to get Nehemiah in this fearful state to do something to which they could point to and say, "Gotcha. Gotcha." Gotcha games are popular with some enemies of the cross. With their slanted questions, their subtle goading, they'll try to catch you in your words. They'll try to pounce on anything that they might be able to try to use to their advantage to be able to say, "Gotcha." Another simple but unambiguous response from Nehemiah, verse 11, "I will not go in." Not going to do it. He follows that up with a prayer that left the matter in God's hands. If you'll look down to verse 14. "Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, O my God, according to these things that they did, and also the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid." Nehemiah was put in a position that if he had allowed it to be so, he could have been overcome with a desire for vengeance. But he wasn't going to do that. As has been pointed out in other lessons, and no doubt will be pointed out in lessons to come as we continue to work our way through Nehemiah, Nehemiah was a man of prayer. And throughout this whole ordeal, as they make their last-ditch effort to try to stop the wall from being rebuilt and finished, they tried to play Nehemiah for a fool. And he knew it. And if you've ever been in a situation where somebody tries to play you for a fool, it can be not only frustrating, it can be infuriating. And in our anger, we can, if we're not careful, want to respond in kind and respond in a similar way and take a vengeful attitude and disposition. Nehemiah was in a position of leadership where he could have tried that. But what a great example he gives. As frustrating as it might have been to have to deal with these letters and all these things that keep coming, and this invitation and that invitation and this threat and that threat, Nehemiah put it in God's hands. He turned to God, kept his heart pure, and turned to God and essentially said, God, I place this in your hands. I'll let you deal with it. I'm not going to enact personal vengeance. But, he says, remember them for what they've done. Anything wrong with that prayer? Don't the Scriptures teach, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord? Well, that's the Lord's business, right? That's all He's asking God to do, is what God said He's in the business of doing. Remember them, O Lord. I'll let you deal with this. I'm not going to deal with it myself. Nehemiah had what one person described as his own internal spam filter. And when that junk mail from Sanballat came in, his internal spam filter recognized it and quickly sent it to the proper folder. I would encourage all of us, if we don't have one already, create our own internal spam filters. And don't allow cantankerous people, brethren or not, move us away from the purposes for which we exist, to honor and glorify God in our particular areas, with our particular people, to the best of our ability. There will always be distractions if we'll allow ourselves to be distracted by them. Nehemiah teaches us to not allow that to happen. But here's how this chapter comes to a close. You know, there were essentially two results mentioned in this chapter that came about as a result of Nehemiah handling these distractions the way he handled them. What resulted in or from Nehemiah saying no, repeatedly saying no, not giving in to threats, not giving in to fear? What happened? Well, number one, the wall got completed. Verse 15, it was finished. And in verse 16, his enemies were disheartened. They finally gave up. Doesn't James tell us that resisting the devil can cause him to flee? James 4:7. As we think about our own work, you know, we can experience times of respite We can experience times of relative peace in our particular areas of work if we refuse to give the enemies of God what they want. It's true that Nehemiah's challenges will not be over for good from this point forward. He's going to have other challenges. But it is interesting to me that after these 3 chapters, 4, 5, and 6, that are focused primarily on problems and dissensions and enemies and distractions and all these things that tried to frustrate the work, you have 3 chapters of that. That after this chapter, in the next few, we do see a more positive emphasis, a bit more positive tone. They got some relief. They got some respite. Oh, good. Invitation. Let me get you a card. No? Does that mean I got to stop? 5 minutes. Okay, I'm about done. Have you lost focus? Because maybe some antagonist in your own life has distracted you from the work that God has placed in front of you? Have you let fear get such a hold in your own mind and heart that fear now has been dictating your choices more than faith has? Has all the noise around you made it seem like your choices are harder than they really are? I don't know that Nehemiah's choices were that hard in and of themselves, just as far as just laying the choices out. It would have been hard because of the emotion wrapped up in it and the tendency toward fear that might have tried to get into his heart. But the choices themselves, absent those things, not all that difficult. But a lot of that noise around those choices can make them seem harder than they really are. If that describes you, Nehemiah might say to you, clarify God's will for your life. Know what the will of the Lord is, Ephesians 5:17. Clarify that. Respond to distractions simply and decisively. Turn your enemies over to God's justice and get back to work. Thank you.
There are a handful of things that, for me, are consistent with what we do at Focal Point. You've seen us make adjustments on the fly this year. We've changed the time of when things are going to happen. There are certain speakers who can't be here. If at all possible, Eddie will accept the invitation to come, and when you give him a text, he'll handle it accurately and thoroughly, and I appreciate that so very much, brother. Thank you for your study and delivery of it, and the passion that you have for preaching. I know that there's not a man in this room, not a family in this room that's in ministry that hasn't gone through the periods and moments of opposition. It's just part of working with people and among people, and we probably, whether we want to admit it or not or realize it or not, have been the source of opposition for others at times in the way that we've responded and acted to them. But to be reminded of how great our God is through that and the fact that the work can still continue is a great message that Nehemiah reveals that you brought to us, and I'm so thankful for that. This is our last together session of the day. There are 2 options at 2:30, 3 at 3:30. Just remember the shift we made earlier. If the third lesson in the list will now be moved into the auditorium. Sit, if you would, in the middle sections toward the back so we can have a more classroom feel for that. So that's the third one at 3:30 that will be in here. If you are coming to the dinner tonight, first of all, you should have already signed up. The list is full. But we ask that you would be here by 6 or so and assemble here in the auditorium so we can have a prayer together and then dismiss and go orderly back there, because the hallways need to stay clear as we get everyone through the line and get things the way they need to be done. So thank you for helping with that. Is there anything that I have missed that needs to be mentioned from anybody? All right, let's stand dismissed. Our next sessions will begin in about 15 minutes.